Sarah will be here to mainly talk about her role as Active Travel Commissioner, but you can't have someone like Sarah here without discussing her other, little sideline that you may not have heard of. But, for the benefit of anyone that's calling in from abroad, I'll just say that Sarah is an elite athlete, kind of the highest caliber. She competes in and wins, storms it, both able-bodied and para events. She's Britain's most successful female Paralympian to date, with 14 gold medals across cycling and swimming. She holds more than 30 world championship titles and I believe 75 world records. Sarah might need to correct me on that. And she competed in her first Paralympics in Barcelona at 14 and was due to compete in Tokyo this year, but obviously COVID turned the world upside down. So I guess my first question to you, Sarah, is, you've achieved so much in your athletic career. Kind of what motivates you to keep going? And because next year, I understand, if you compete in Tokyo again, that's going to be your 30th anniversary of competitions. I mean, plenty of other kind of athletes would have just retired by now, gone into commentating, or but what keeps motivating you to push yourself and carry on?
Well, I think it's that whole, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me as well, Leanne. For me, it's just the whole jigsaw puzzle of a performance. And I guess it's, I've not grown tired of trying to find the best version of myself, which is actually a hashtag we use with our cycling team, Storey Racing. And it's about trying to translate that into everyday performances to go a little bit further, a little bit better. And also that works in everyday life as well. And I find that it's a really good yin and yang. So I'm working in day-to-day life as the Active Travel Commissioner in various other different roles, but also having that athletic focus gives me that time away to really keep pushing myself. And I've not grown tired of it. And I think also seeing the journey that I'm on with my children in tow now just turns it into a different journey again. So since Louisa arrived in 2013 and Charlie in 2017, it's just made that journey ever so slightly different and just as motivating to kind of take them along with me.
Yeah, it must be lovely being able to have them come to see you at the events and be cheering you on. Great for them as well, all the travel and seeing different countries at such a young age. It's a real privilege.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the perks of the job, I think. It takes a lot of logistical planning, and obviously in the COVID crisis, the replanning for the games next year, obviously it gave us a second bite at the cherry if we didn't think we were quite happy with what we'd planned for the first attempt at getting to Japan. But also being able to kind of pull them into this, the concept of making things COVID secure, being in a bubble, making sure they're happy and catered for, at the same time as me with my responsibilities to that secure bio bubble of a race environment. And unfortunately, at the moment in parasport, we haven't had that opportunity to create bio bubbles and test it. Parasport has been almost certainly the last sport, apart from tennis, I think, to come back into any kind of normality. And whilst the men's in cycling sport came first and the women's pro tours come second, parasport hasn't restarted at all. So it's been really challenging. And also in the UK, we haven't had any elite sport restart either. So that's made it even more challenging.
As you mentioned, kind of Tokyo next year, how has COVID kind of impacted on your training? Kind of have you been able to maybe take it a little easier this year, or are you having to kind of maintain, like kind of train at the same level but for an extra year? I mean, does that, obviously I know nothing about the physiology kind of your body, but does that tire you out, or are you competing ordinarily kind of so regularly that you're uber fit anyway?
Well, training is in cycles, so you can't maintain what we call the very top end of your physiology for a very long period of time, and you have to take time into that and away from that. So that's why we talk about peaking for specific events. And some people will peak, 3 or 4 times a year. Other people will have a very high level naturally and then go up from there again for, one or two major events in a year. So when lockdown first happened in March, we were very much aware of the potential side effects of getting COVID and the post-viral fatigue, which is being referred to as long COVID. And we've known about post-viral fatigue for a long time. Anyone who knows about the Epstein-Barr virus, which causes glandular fever and can lead to chronic fatigue. Well, I was one of the unfortunate teenagers who picked up Epstein-Barr and then ended up with chronic fatigue as a result of that. So we all have to be really, really careful within the sporting world that if we do find out that we are COVID positive, that we then take it really carefully. And obviously in March, nobody was really sure who was infected because we'd been going about our daily lives quite normally. For me, I'd been down in London on March the 11th. So when lockdown happened, sort of 10 days later, I was like, well, it's not 2 weeks since I left London, which was obviously where the main part of the pandemic was in the UK to start with. So we have to be really careful around training, but we also then had to build back in some form of cycle to allow us to peak for something during the summer months or to have some form of racing season. Fortunately for cycling, we were able to go out for exercise once a day. And so we used that generally to go out on our road bikes, especially because the weather was so good in that March and April period and May. But we also took our racing online. And so the Women's Tour of Britain was a virtual race using the very laptop I'm talking to you today, but sat in my garage with a dust sheet behind me to hide all the other things that were, you wouldn't want to see in somebody's garage. And then we just had to try and, gradually see what races were coming back online. So I think my very first real life race was over just east of Doncaster. I've done a race nearer to home at Jodrell Bank, and then I've done one in Thruxton. I've done a hill climb, and then sadly a couple of races were cancelled for various different reasons, some of them COVID related. So we have had a reasonably good season of racing. We've just had to really adapt. And that's given us that opportunity to take an end of season break at the same time as normal. So my end of season break finishes on Saturday, tomorrow. And then I'll restart training on Sunday, ready to build back up again through the winter, more online racing because most track events are cancelled, and hopefully come out in the spring with some form of road calendar that will see us through into the Tokyo Games.
Yeah, I think I've seen online that you refer to your garage as your pain cave.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a fairly common, referral thing. So we're racing from home. We're in our pain cave. Some people have them inside the house. If I want to do a heat chamber session, I'll use the utility room and turn the radiator on and add a couple of heaters. But generally in the garage, you can regulate your body temperature a little bit better.
God, it must be hard though. With the training, if you're not having access to the same facilities, the same professional facilities that you would usually have in ordinary times, and having to be creative, it might be put a bit more pressure kind of on you to try and get that training right, because you don't have everything just right there for you.
In some ways, I'm very, very, very fortunate that I don't have that many specific facility requirements. So I won't go to the velodrome for more than 3 or 4 weeks ahead of a major event anyway. So not being able to access that. I mean, we can access that at the moment if we want to. And there's a COVID secure way of getting into that bio bubble. But apart from that, the only thing that I really use and need is an environment chamber. And sadly, the access to that is not possible at the moment for a number of reasons, not just COVID related either. So for me, just not being able to go into that environment chamber, have the hypoxic training. So it takes me to a virtual world of 13% oxygen. And then the heat in there can be anything that we like it to be. But we generally set it around 30, 32 degrees with sort of 80% humidity so that we can start to stimulate the body's response to heat acclimatization. And by doing that a little bit early, we also can affect our body's blood plasma levels, and that then helps us to gradually build up to when we will eventually be competing in the heat of Tokyo. It's not vital, but it's an extra added thing that you can have. But I think it's worth remembering that most people around the world aren't getting access to these facilities at the moment either. So the fact that I have a mask and a generator at home so I can do some training with hypoxia means that I am very, very fortunate. It's just not as good because you can't drink when you've got your mask on.
Yeah.
So you have to be quite careful with how you do things.
And just one last question before I hand over to Molly. You mentioned about how parasport hasn't come back, and women's racing as well. And I'm just thinking, what are your feelings about kind of women being underrepresented in the sport? I read an article, an interview that you did where you said, there aren't kind of elite female races in this, such as an equivalent to the Tour de France, which is so kind of high profile. What do you feel needs to change in order to allow that to happen? I know you have your own team, Team Storey. Well, I don't want to steer you too much. How can things improve really in terms of parasport or women's sport representation? Basically, is what I'm trying to ask.
Well, I think women's sport and parasport are on a parallel journey, and for parasport, we're a number of years behind the women's side of the sport, and cycling is one of the least equal sports that you'll find. So with tennis, the women compete at the same championships, the 4 majors. They have, the same platform, the same prize money, the same coverage. And if there's, a decision to be made about who is on the showcase courts, then they make that decision based on the quality of the tennis, not based on gender. So at the moment, there's a huge amount of focus on the men's tennis because of some of those rivalries that have been there for many, many donkeys of years, you could say. And the female side of the sport doesn't quite have those rivalries in the same way. But when it was, in the 80s, 90s, the big, rivalries, the women's tennis was really taken on more than the men's. And in cycling, we don't have that. Coming from swimming, it was very equal, other than the distance of the longest event in the pool where the women do 800 and the men do 1500 meters. Swimming had the same number of medals, the same opportunities, the same platform. There was a men's race, there was a women's race, there was men's relays, there was women's relays, and now they've evolved to have mixed relays. Athletics as well, very, 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 very equal, and they've built up to that since the days of allowing eventually the women to do the steeplechase, for example. So in cycling, we are quite far behind, and we have to address this, but we also have to appreciate the commercial model in elite and pro cycling is quite, it's on a knife edge really, and the women's side is not getting the same platform as the men's side, and so that means that women's teams are much more likely to be in financial trouble. They're not as likely to have the same investment because the return on investment is just so much less than there is in the men's. So we need to try and find a way and a business model that works to bring the women's side back up, or bring it into where the men's side is now. And I think the sad thing for cycling, specifically around the Tour de France, is there used to be a women's Tour de France alongside the men. So if you, for example, look up the podium from the 1986 Tour de France, you'll see the women and the men on the same podium in Paris on the Champs-Élysées, having all, both genders done the same distance for 3 weeks. So it was a commercial decision made at the end of the 1980s that the women's side just wasn't as lucrative, and therefore a decision made by a group of men, unfortunately, that they didn't want to continue with that side of the sport. So we do need to bring that back, and we need to then learn from those messages and those that journey to bring parasport into more mainstream opportunities and platforms. So, for example, within the UK, the Paralympic Games is incredibly well covered. It's wall-to-wall coverage. Channel 4 put that there on their all of their different channels across social media as well, and the different media platforms you can watch it and stream it. But then in the 3 years between Paralympics, it drops off the edge of a cliff. There's no coverage at all, and that just isn't acceptable. And it's something that really does need addressing, because you often find that one of the questions you get asked when you go to a Games is, have you been competing? And it's like, well, of course I have. There's been a World Championships every year. There's been national championships. There's been other events to compete in. And I think one of the reasons why I have a platform as an athlete is because I'm fortunate enough to be able to compete in the women's peloton, and that has more coverage. So there's a long way to go for parasport. And I think COVID has really shown those, those gaps even greater than they should be, because they've brought back the sport that has, I suppose, the highest commercial value first, and not realize the opportunity that we need in the ones with less commercial value at the moment. And we have to close that gap.
Yeah, definitely. Right, we'll just pass over to Molly now. And so just to remind you all, if you have a question for Sarah, if you just put it through in the chat, and then Molly will come to you at the end. So over to you, Molly.
Well, thanks, Leanne. Morning, Sarah. So, Sheffield City Region, you have a new role. You've done your athletics, your cycling, and then you've come over to join Mayor Dan Jarvis. You came over in 2019, April Fool's Day, but it was definitely not a joke. Do you just want to explain to people what the role is that you do at the Sheffield City Region?
Yeah, so thanks, Molly. It's brilliant to be able to chat about this, especially in Sheffield as well. When Mayor Jarvis was elected as the Mayor of Sheffield City Region, and one of his manifesto pledges was to make it more possible for people to walk and cycle short distances, and to bring active travel, as we call walking, cycling, scooting, anything that doesn't involve a motorised vehicle, to make it a real more of a mainstream form of transport that people look to as being more serious than perhaps it's been taken in the past. And we know it's not been taken seriously because the funding for active travel, for cycling and walking in particular, has been incredibly piecemeal. It's been very stop-start, and there has never been a long-term strategy, and that's true across the country. So my role was to really pull that focus together and to bring the 4 parts of the region, Barnsley, Doncaster, Rotherham and Sheffield together, and to create a region-wide network and also a longer-term strategy. So our strategy looks ahead to the next 20 years so that we can really see that gradual build of a network that will be usable and will take people from the places where they live and work to the places where they want to go. And we're not just talking about the traditional cycle to work type journeys. We're talking about being able to go to the shops, being able to go to your friend's house, being able to take the kids swimming, and being able to enable people to use all sorts of different types of bike, because it's really important that this isn't looked at as being a white middle class hobbyist benefit. It has to be for everybody. So it's to enable children to cycle to school, to enable people who have adapted cycles, whether that's for mobility reasons or whether it's a cargo bike to carry things, people, goods, and also to look at how it affects the business community, so that we can look at last mile deliveries and really removing as many vehicles as possible from that urban area to make it a more pleasant place to live and work.
Brill, and you sort of mentioned a few of these in them, but when you became commissioner, you made 4 pledges that would sort of shape your work in Sheffield and the wider region, and they were being led by communities, enabling walking and cycling rather than encouraging it, which I know is very important to you, requiring infrastructure, so bike lanes, paths, to meet or exceed safety requirements, and for requiring infrastructure to be accessible to all. Now, they were your personal pledges. I know that, did you think them up in a coffee shop in Leeds, was it? They sort of came to fruition there, where all the best ideas happen. But I just wanted to know why was it those 4? What is it about those 4 pledges that was important to you personally, sort of as Sarah and as commissioner, that made you say, right, these are the 4 that I'm gonna live and die by almost?
Well, one of the things that we really wanted to make sure was that, and the chat you referred to in the coffee house in Leeds was with our active travel program director. And when we appointed Pete as that program director to work with me, we wanted to come up with a strategy that people could relate to. So being led by communities was really important, because people have to want this infrastructure, these facilities, to be where they live and work. Even for people who are absolutely welded to the vehicle and the steering wheel of that vehicle, it's still really, really important for those people that other people will walk and cycle, because we just don't have the capacity on our roads for the growing number of vehicle trips that we see year on year. And if you have a look at my Twitter feed this week, I think it was on Wednesday, I did a bit of a thread around how vehicle journeys are affecting us in the region. And there's also some stats in there across the whole country. And we're not alone in seeing millions and billions more vehicle trips each year. And that's just not sustainable. So it needs to be led by communities, because people need to tell us what they want to see. We also need the infrastructure to exceed previous standards and to be not just for safety, for access needs. So we need to see the convenience of active travel being a lot more available. We need to see it looking a lot more attractive to people, so that it's a better alternative for those short journeys. In Sheffield City Region, people going to work, 40% of journeys of a kilometre or less are still driven, and they could easily be walked. And it's probably quicker to walk when you think about, by the time you've found somewhere to park at the other end of that kilometre, you could probably have got down there on foot, or certainly on your bike as well. So that's one of the reasons why we need to make sure that those standards are really much better than they have been before. So it's a much more attractive option to take that short journey on foot or by bike. We also need it to be enabled and not encouraged, because if you encourage people to use something that's not safe, then they're not going to use it because they don't feel safe. So you enable people by building that infrastructure to the right standard. And finally, the accessibility of it is really a no-brainer. It's often overlooked. If you're disabled or you have health issues, it shouldn't exclude you from using the sort of machine that is accessible to you. So that's probably going to be some kind of e-bike, especially in Sheffield with all the hills. But it's also going to be maybe a trike, maybe a four-wheel bike that's more stable. And we have some case studies of residents in Sheffield who have already been incredibly single-minded in getting themselves on their wheels, their non-motorized wheels, despite the fact that they have some health challenges. And they really are beacons of hope for many other people. And connected to that is our Wheels for All network. And we're the first region in the country to appoint a dedicated regional coordinator to really build up that network to make sure more people can access cycling regardless of their situation. And it's estimated about 1 in 5 people have some form of disability or access need. So that's a significant part of the population.
Great, thank you. And just for those who've not heard of Wheels for All before, it's accessible cycling, isn't it? They're set up in Hillsborough Park, and I know that you visited them last year. I don't know if you wanted to explain a bit more about who they are and what they do, just quickly.
Yeah, so Wheels for All is a nationwide group, cycling projects on social media if you want to look them up. And Wheels for All centres appear across the country, but they're a little bit of a postcode lottery, depending where there's access to a park and the type of machines that they need. But they are in all 4 regions as well. So they're in Scotland as well as Wales, as well as England and Northern Ireland. And what we want to do is increase the density of the access to those centres, because what allows people to do is to access a bike, first of all, before they buy one or before they look to hire one permanently. And it allows them to try out the different types of machines that might be available, also in an environment where it's traffic free. So the one we have in Hillsborough Park, obviously, is traffic free. It's got trained volunteers there who are used to helping people learn to ride bikes or learn to kind of work out what they need from a bike. And our plan is that if more people can feel enabled to actually use a bike in the first place, by the time we get this infrastructure built, it will enable people to have a bit more independence. Because for some people, they have to rely on somebody coming around with a vehicle to pick them up, to take them a very, very short distance to the shops. And it would be much more fantastic for them to have the feeling of the wind on their face, to enjoy cycling in the way that so many other people take for granted. And so these Wheels for All centres are a vital part of a whole spectrum of cycling, and also as a place that perhaps young disabled children could go to access the different types of adapted bikes as well, because who knows, one of them may want to go on to race that bike, although that's not a focus, it's just one of those added bonuses that might come along.
Well, thank you. And sort of you've touched on it a little bit there, but one big question is why is all this important, both to you as an individual and to the communities you've just mentioned? You know, I know you've got 2 young kids. Look, people on this call will probably have kids, and just sort of why is this important for them and for us as we sort of come out of COVID? Really, we'll come on to COVID in a bit, but yeah, what drives you? Why is this important for you?
Well, active travel is incredibly important because over the last 50 years or so, we've prioritised trips by car and by other types of vehicle. And we've really built activity out of people's lives, and we've never had a more inactive population. The current generation of school children have not expected to live as long as their parents, and that's the first time that's happened in many, many decades. And it's incredibly sad to think that because of a lack of activity and because we've prioritised being able to go door to door in a vehicle, we're actually reducing people's outlook for the future. But it's also about reducing the cost of the health service. And that's obviously been in the spotlight more this year than ever before. Because if we can prevent people from having ailments that are caused by inactivity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cardiovascular problems, then we'll reduce the cost of the health service, and we'll make it less likely that those people will spend their older years in ill health. And for some people, they meet that ill health younger and younger, so they spend even longer in ill health. And the cost on medications and on being able to access that medical services is just getting bigger and bigger. And this is a global challenge, and we have to access this globally, but here in Sheffield City region, we can all play our part. So it's important for health, it's important for well-being. And as we've spoken a lot about this over the past 7 or 8 months, one of the side effects of the pandemic is an unspoken about mental health challenge. And exercise is known and proven to support people who have mental health issues and who have challenges and who come in and out of mental health problems. And so if we can get more people more active and get those happy endorphins flowing, it will help them manage their condition better as well.
Well, and we've definitely seen, and sort of Leanne touched on this earlier, over lockdown, people have been digging bikes out of sheds, out of garages. They've been walking around places they've never walked before. Has that had a positive impact on what you're trying to do, sort of from a people getting behind the idea of active travel? I know there's a whole other issue with politicians getting behind it, but we'll stick to the people for today.
Definitely, lockdown presented a world to people that none of us had imagined happening. So everybody suddenly lived in a low traffic neighbourhood, for example. And low traffic neighbourhoods are, an opportunity for more people to be outside more often. They're less likely to be a risk of speeding vehicles going through them, and they're more likely to promote, socialising within your local area. And also people found that the streets were quiet enough for them to want to venture out. And with fewer vehicles around and the less danger, people felt more confident. And so that enabled people to dig those bikes out. So suddenly active travel became much more of a priority to many people. And they started to sort of understand some of the messages that we've been putting out there over the previous 12 months. And what we'd done within our strategy to build our 20-year plan was that we'd gone around those local authorities and worked with the regional leaders to promote active travel into this plan and to get them to realise just what an important part. It's the glue of the transport system, because if you want more people to use trains and buses, you need them to walk or cycle in between those journeys to join up that longer journey. You want them to walk or cycle to the bus stop and train station in the morning as a first point, a first journey, rather than taking the vehicle there and expecting to need to find a parking space. So we started to get people to really understand that it was the glue to so many parts of our society, and that it was something that was relevant to everybody, because Chris Whitty stood on the lectern at the daily briefing and said there isn't a condition where increasing exercise wouldn't be of benefit. And whether that's having an opportunity just for 1 minute for someone who's really struggling with a fatigue type illness, to be able to get outside and have some fresh air, that's really important for that person, in terms of they're not necessarily physically moving very far, but they're just enjoying being outside in fresh air. We also saw a massive improvement in air quality, and places where are normally congested with vehicles and have very high levels of dangerous air pollutants, they disappeared. And we saw those incredible images from NASA looking across China to start with, where there was no aeroplanes, there was no vehicles, and all of a sudden that smog, as perhaps is referred to, it disappeared. You could see landmass more easily. And so air quality readings improved, and people with asthma and other respiratory illnesses realised that they lived in a place that was more polluted than they realised. And obviously all of that related to a more worse form of COVID-19 as well. So we really got to put our programme at a much higher priority. And that led to myself and Dan Jarvis writing to the Prime Minister at the end of April to say we have to prioritise walking and cycling as we come out of the lockdown, to try and make sure that we don't return to higher levels of vehicle use, which would obviously be detrimental even further.
Oh yeah, I definitely remember sort of cycling up Ecclesall Road South, people in Sheffield, which is quite a big hill, and thinking I'd got really fit because I was less out of breath, but it was just that the air I was breathing was a lot cleaner, so my lungs were taking it better. So definitely saw it around where we are. Right, before we move on to questions from the chat, one final question. 2040, 20 years time, what is your vision? What do you want to see across Sheffield, across the rest of South Yorkshire? How are people travelling about? How are kids getting to school? What do our streets look like?
Well, I'd love to think that our local authority partners will have instigated the active travel implementation plan, which is available to see on the website, and the Sheffield City Region website. The plan really enables everyone to make those good decisions about where they prioritise space for people over vehicles, and allows them to make decisions to put active travel ahead of all of the vehicle traffic that has been prioritised in the last 50 years. So seeing children being able to walk or cycle or scoot to school, seeing fewer vehicles journeys taken. If people can take those vehicle journeys that are 5 kilometres or less at the moment and actually translate those onto active travel journeys, it will transform our region, it will transform our world, in fact. So we need to see this plan instigated, and I can advise and take people along that journey from the messaging point of view, but we also have to make our councils feel confident enough to take these decisions as well. So by telling them that we want to see this, by reporting when we're happy, because so often we see that we're plagued by things that people are unhappy with, but when people are really happy with seeing something change, it's not often covered. So we have a duty to support them in making those good decisions of knowing where people want the infrastructure, but seeing that comprehensive network where people can walk or cycle their short journeys. We have 15-20-minute neighbourhoods where all the goods and services you need are available without the need of your vehicle, and places where people can sit and rest and be outside and enjoy that environment and it be less polluted would just be an absolutely incredible place to be. And we saw a transformation just across the North Sea in the Netherlands. It took around 20 years from the 1970s into the 1990s, but they see 25% of their journeys are done on foot or by bike. The longer journeys are taken on public transport, and people still use their cars. And we're not trying to eradicate vehicles from our lives. We're just trying to make sure that we only use them when it's absolutely necessary.
Well, that segues quite nicely into Adam's question. Now, Adam works in designing housing and workplacing across South Yorkshire. So he's probably a man you want to keep on your good side. And he's asked, how do you plan to address planning standards that still prioritise motorised travel, typically requiring 2 car parking spaces per new house? So how do we address those challenges in the planning world?
Yeah, so part of the role since we've established our 20-year strategy has been to feed into the other strategies across the region. And this is something that also needs to be done from the top down, so something that government can affect positively as well. But we need to see active travel in every single part of our regional plan. So whatever it is that we're building or doing, active travel needs to be in there. And that's something that it's part of my bang on about list that Molly helps me to devise every now and then. But this is a permanent feature there, that everything you do, the first question should be, how will people get there on foot or by bike? Not how easily can they park outside of this building. And so this is a change of mindset that is needed across society, because I think that's the first thing most people think about is I'm going to make a journey, and they make that assumption they're going to do it in their car. So everyone has to go on that kind of virtual journey with themselves as well. Can I make that journey on foot? Can I make that journey on my bike? First of all, you'll be asking, is it safe to do so? And that's where we can feed those messages into the councils and the local authorities making decisions on where the network gets built first. But also when we're building new things, making sure that we prioritise the opportunity to have pavements there, because some places are built with no pavement, and that's obviously no good at all. So it's really important we keep talking about that important thing. And will be pushing to feed into all of the different plans. And we've fed into the roads plan for the region. We have strong links to all of the different parts of the public transport network. And I've spoken at 2 or 3 different events for the Transport for the North and the Northern Powerhouse to make sure that active travel is maintained at the top of that agenda. Because the first thing we do every morning is walk out of our front door, or wheel out if we're a wheelchair user, and how we then go from the end of our property, from that front door onwards, it needs to be on foot or by bike first, rather than automatically be jumping into a vehicle.
Well, thank you. And Adam, I think you had another question for Sarah. Do you want to ask that?
Yeah, so my other one, I've done a bit of research when I was a student on cycling choices, and that we know from that and the reading I did that the thing that encourages people to take up cycling or to try it out is safe traffic-free routes. You just have to go out to the Peak District and see Monsell Trail to evidence that. How are you going to create those type of routes within cities like Sheffield and towns like Barnsley and Doncaster? How do you go about doing it? Where are they going to be? And what are the challenges that are going to prevent you doing it?
Well, first of all, the challenge is the political will to reallocate the road space. We need segregated cycleways, and we have one of our standards is that if the number of vehicles per hour is more, I think it's more than 250, if it's more than 30 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour or more, it needs to be segregated. So that means it's a cycle track that's alongside a road initially. So if you look at the 2040 the map, the vast majority of those routes on the 2040 map are segregated cycleways, Dutch style, if you like, the ones that you would see overseas, where they're alongside the vehicle lane. And they're not a mandatory cycle lane, because if you're a faster cyclist, then you'll probably use the vehicle lane still, because you'll be going the speed of the traffic. But they're for people who aren't comfortable with going the speed of the traffic. And that's really important, that we have that in places where people can see the infrastructure so that they can access it easily. It looks like it's a more attractive option than sitting in the traffic jam. People are more likely to think, this is a really short journey, I could easily do this on my bike, I'm going to do that tomorrow. So we have to build that type of infrastructure to make it possible for people to do their everyday journeys. But you're absolutely right that the most people will start and make a decision to walk or cycle by doing it in their leisure time. And we recognise that it's important to have leisure routes as well. So there are some fantastic off-road routes that we're supporting the building of. We're making sure people are aware of the importance of, but it's not an either or. So for example, we've got the Upper Don Valley Trail, I think it is, that's being built from Stockbridge into the city centre. But alongside that, we'll need something along the road past Hillsborough, because we need to make sure that that current shared use path on the pavement that goes through some car showrooms, it's just not fit for purpose at the moment. It's terrible. And I've done some media work along there to kind of highlight why it's so bad, apart from the fact that vehicles are parked on the pavement as well. It's just dangerous. And it means that pedestrians are at risk, people on bikes are at risk because of things like extendable dog leads. And it's really, really challenging for both users, whereas the vehicle lane, the vehicles don't have to make any compromise currently. So we do need to have that political will to reallocate road space, to make space for all modes. And we need to make sure that where it's unsafe to have vehicles and people mixed, that we have those segregated cycle tracks alongside the vehicle lane.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks very much.
Yes, Adam. Now, you've got a question about juggling. Well, I'll let you ask it, Karen. Are you still with us, Karen? I think Karen might have had to log off. It was a question about juggling children in the hills of Sheffield, and I feel like I already know the answer to that one, but I'll let you say it.
Yeah, many of the journeys people say they need their vehicles for because they're trip chaining. So they're doing one trip and then they're doing another trip off the back of that trip. So the total cost of those trips, or the total length of that journey, will be longer than just the first kilometre to pick up the kids from school, because the next part of the trip is going another 1.5 kilometres to the swimming pool or whatever. And it's absolutely, it's very valid. If you're carrying stuff, then, a single person bike isn't going to be suitable, and it's also not legal unless it has a second seat and it's built for 2 people. So this is where cargo bikes need to become more mainstream, and we're starting to see more and more people have access to them. And the more people that have access, the more cost efficient they will become. But we also need to see a subsidy for electric versions of these vehicles, because we often hear politicians, and Grant Shapps talks about this frequently, about the e-car subsidies. But we need all sorts of electric vehicles to be subsidised and more available, because the e-car is fine, but it doesn't solve the problem of congestion, and it doesn't address the challenge of the health agenda. So e-bikes, you still have to pedal a little bit, but the assistance it gives you uphill, it is sufficient to mean that you could carry your kids. But we just need them to be more mainstream and available, and we also need it to feel safe enough for people to want to use them with that precious cargo on board, something I completely get. So having got an e-bike now, it's unbelievable how good it is to be able to get uphill on it, but we need the infrastructure so that people who are less confident can feel safe. And part of that within the hills of Sheffield and going from schools to other places is the removal of parked vehicles and making it less, making people need vehicles less. And so those 2-3 vehicle households that park all 3 of those vehicles on the street, we need to enable them to not need all 3. And we've started to see a number of people talk about replacing the 2nd or 3rd vehicle with an e-bike. And that's something that we need to see more of as we move forward in the next 3, 4, 5 years.
Lovely, thank you. And Owen, your question next, please. Is Owen with us? You're
on mute.
Okay. Does the sport of cycling need to use its profile more to promote active travel, or is that part of the problem, as people associate cycling with a sport or hobby rather than a form of travel? Because I think of like the mammals and, you know, the stigma that's attached to that.
I think this is a role for the media. The media have a huge role to play in making sure that when they talk about cycling, they don't just assume and make the assumption that they're going to be referring to people who are wearing lycra or going out training. And in Holland, they have two words for cyclist. They have a word for the sporting cyclist, and they have a word for an everyday cyclist. And, you know, I made the suggestion when I took the role in Sheffield that might be something, and it was met with some interesting comments and feedback, shall we say. We do need vehicle drivers to completely get what we're talking about as well. And seeing a bike shouldn't mean that a red mist descends. But the media have a massive part to play here, and they really can influence this positively with the right sort of headlines, with the right sort of language, and ensuring that we expect people who can do the greatest threat of harm to take the most responsibility. And I always use the analogy of a person in a gym. So if you're the biggest, strongest, heaviest person in a gym and you can lift the biggest weights, if you then started charging around that gym to get everybody out of your way so that you could use all of the machines first, then you'd soon be told exactly what your place was and required to be responsible. And we need to do that on our roads. We need people to understand that they're driving a potential weapon, and that the way in which they conduct themselves behind that wheel could potentially change their life, but massively change another person and another family's life as well. And that's really, really important. So we can do more in cycling. People like myself and Chris Boardman, who have an interest in, you know, cycling for transport. You'll see many of the pro cyclists, they'll use cycling to get around, but it's just a normal thing for them. They don't think twice about the need to promote it, because for them, they've grown up on a bike, they just use it to get to the shops, and they're incredibly good role models. They just don't realize that it needs publicizing quite as much as we all do. So yeah, we definitely need to address how people talk about cycling, and people in normal clothes just meandering about on a bike. We're not talking about speed. We need to make sure people on bikes are responsible as well. But they're very, very few and far between, the irresponsible bike users, compared to the irresponsible vehicle users. But you wouldn't necessarily believe that if you were to read all of the headlines that you often find in the press.
Cheers, Sarah. I'm definitely a meanderer, and it always annoys the men in lycra when I overtake them. It's quite amusing. Right, Holly, you're up next. You've got you're a teacher, so you've got a teacher-related question.
I do have a teacher-related question. Hi, Sarah. Good to meet you. Yeah, I guess I grew up cycling everywhere in Cambridge. So I've only recently moved to Sheffield 5 years ago. So for me, it's really weird that everyone doesn't just cycle in their everyday clothes. And I love that idea of lots of young people cycling to school. And my question was, yeah, as a teacher and a runner and a cyclist, how can I encourage my students to get to school through active transport? Do you have any resources, any fundraising we could do, any posters I could show them? I keep trying to encourage them, and none of them are very keen to sweat uphill.
Well, I think the first thing to ask is it safe? So we don't encourage anything that's not safe. So if they can't get to that place in a safe way, then we can't encourage them to do it. They can all walk. They may need to take extra care on those roads where vehicles insist on parking on the pavement, and be extra vigilant at crossings, because vehicles don't always realise that people will want to cross the road between parked cars. But the cycling side of things, that's where they could come together as a group and really lobby the council for the opportunity to cycle to college, to school. And we see some primary schools are doing this. They're part of the Living Streets programme, where they're walking to school on a regular basis, and they're off the back of that, once they've gone through all the graded badges and become a gold, the MotorShift stars as well, become like a gold award place. They then start to use that platform of the number of people to say to the council, look, we want to have a school street here. We want to close part of our road at certain times of the day to enable the children to access the school safely, without the risk of vehicles being there. And so there's a number of things that can be done practically to make it safe to happen. And off the back of establishing whether it's safe and how you could actually change that safety element, then you can engage with the likes of Sustrands and Living Streets and some of the other programs that the councils are working with as well to promote that type of activity. But the first thing that has to happen is that we need to make sure that it's safe for it to happen in the first place.
Thanks.
Thank you. Right, we've got 3 more questions to go. So I'll go to Leah next. You may be on mute, Leah.
Sorry, I am on mute. Hi, Sarah. My question's about the like the Boris Bike scheme that was brought into Sheffield. I think it was about 5 years ago that it was first thought up, and then it was implemented over the following couple of years. I wouldn't quite use the phrase unmitigated disaster, but it wasn't the best implemented scheme. Although I think uptake was really good on it, but it received relatively bad press because of the vandalism that occurred, and eventually the scheme was withdrawn. My question is, do you think that that sort of scheme could or should be re-implemented? And if so, what could be done differently to make it more of a success?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think Sheffield wasn't the only city. Even bigger cities have had and continue to have the same challenges in implementing a suitable bike hire scheme. And Manchester had Mobike. I think was it Mobike in Sheffield as well. Manchester's Mobike scheme was sort of questionable as well, and they haven't quite settled. I think they're coming to the point where they're settling on a new scheme. And I think that's exactly what needs to happen in Sheffield. But we also need to make it, you know, more of a mainstream opportunity to prevent that vandalism as well. I think there was opportunists saw it as a way of, you know, just creating fun, if that's the right way of talking about it. I'm not sure what would motivate someone to want to vandalise someone else's property. So it does need to be well thought out, and it is a challenge, and you won't always get it right first time. And it's something that is on our list to implement across the region. It needs to be an integral part of our public transport system to make that work even better as well, because we need people to be able to get off the tram train, off the train, off the bus network, and journey chain utilising active modes. So it is something that we're very keen to pull together, but I think we need to find the right technology to make it easier to use, and also to potentially, and perhaps more importantly, include an E element, because I don't think a bike hire scheme in Sheffield will be completely inclusive unless there's an electric element to it as well. So that makes it quite a complex challenge to solve, and it's something that's certainly on our radar and needs to be well funded as well to make it work properly.
Yeah, either e-bikes or the bike lift, which I know someone once suggested for
yes,
Conduit Road up in Crooks.
Right, a ski lift.
Yeah. Can we go to Kira next, please? Kira's got a question, and then we'll come to Anna, and then we can wrap up.
Hi, Sarah. I guess my question is quite similar in the different kind of schemes that can be introduced. Obviously, the priority that you have is about encouraging active transport, but also does that interlink with actually reducing the amount of households with cars? So I've recently moved to Sheffield, and in London, where I was living before, loads more people are now choosing to live without a car in their household, because there's so many alternative like car clubs and Zip and different things where you can actually use a car as and when you need it, because they're available. This is something I looked into recently in Sheffield, and it's way harder up here. So does that come under what you're trying to achieve, and is it something that you think could be introduced? Would you like it to be introduced, or are you trying to avoid cars altogether?
No, as I said earlier, we're not trying to eradicate cars. Vehicles are vital for certain journeys, but what we need is the whole landscape to work. And one of the reasons why it works so well in London is because you're a bit further ahead in the concept of active neighbourhoods, low traffic neighbourhoods, and that 15-minute neighbourhood, people can walk to their local shops more easily than they can up in the north. And so it's not just a problem in Sheffield, it's also the case across Greater Manchester, all across South Yorkshire, and West Yorkshire and the Midlands as well, and Birmingham have got a few segregated cycleways, but it's certainly not quite yet a connected network. So we need to work on the services being available to people more locally, so that they don't feel the need for their vehicle or their second or third vehicle in their household. And we also need a public transport system that works as effectively as it does in London, and that's a big challenge. So we've been associated with and feeding into the bus review, which has happened in Sheffield quite recently. Clive Betts was in charge of doing that. We also fed into the roads plan to make sure that the roads plan works and matches up to the active travel plan, and how the rail plan works. And that's vital that we look at that that full network, because it isn't just active travel in isolation. And then once we've been able to, drive down that car ownership and make it more possible for people to do local journeys without that vehicle, that runaround, then we can start to look at how we enable people to access a vehicle for the odd longer trip that they might need one. If they say, I don't know, going away with a vehicle full of stuff to go camping or whatever it might be. And that's when car clubs may be something that are more possible. But at the moment, we just need to get the public transport, we get people more used to travelling more locally without the use of a car, and then we can start to build up all of the other options. But at the moment, it's a bit of a vicious circle, because as bus patronage has fallen across the region, and this is something that's a challenge across the north of England, so it's not just confined to Sheffield, as bus patronage has dropped, as public transport capacity is limited during the pandemic, it means people are less likely to want to use public transport. That makes active travel even more important, but it also means it's a really difficult period for driving down, second car, third car ownership. So it's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle, and it's about lining those puzzle pieces up first correctly. And we are starting by working on the low traffic neighbourhoods to enable people to get to where they want to go without that need for a vehicle, as our first, as our first stab at the challenge.
Thank you. And last but not least, we've got Anna. Anna, are you still on the call for your question?
Yeah. I guess my question kind of ties into your point about media coverage and media usage. So it's really talking from a brand's perspective. How can I guess brands tend to focus on that top of the mountain aspirational customer and less on the daily commuter or the cargo bike. Are they working with you? How do you feel their influence should influence the wider market, kind of thing? And would it be of use?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, brands getting behind the campaigns to get more people active every day are really important. For us, being associated with specific things becomes a challenge, because it's for their commercial activity and their overall profit at the end of the day. So we have to be quite careful with how we utilize our work with brands. But I think this is where, what's popular culture, what do people want to do and see? And that's where the media part is really, really important. If something becomes cool, then it becomes, the greater demand for it, because it's publicized more and brands jump on the back of that. And then it starts to talk about, more people doing it. So I think we have, they have a really big role to play, and it's maybe their societal responsibility to look at how they can improve everyone's health in the perhaps less cool ways. But I think cargo bikes are really cool, and maybe I'm just an uncool person myself. But trying to enable people to get around. But I guess as well, it's very difficult to break out of that cycle of supporting vehicles all of the time. Although it's ironic in some ways that some of the adverts for vehicles often they actually promote a very idyllic setting where the vehicle is the only the vehicle they're trying to sell is the only vehicle on the road, and everyone else around that vehicle is walking and cycling. And we often think of the irony of that, whereas the most likely scenario is that when you buy that car, you're just going to be sat in a traffic jam, but they'd never promote it using that environment. So I think it's about looking at how the brands could look at how they could promote this. And it would be great if more people found it more cool to utilize this as a form of transport, and walking especially, because people underrate walking. Walking is an incredibly good form of exercise. It's often just as quick to walk. I know that if I go to London, I usually come into London at London Euston. Meetings are generally around Westminster, and I'll take that opportunity to have a 45-minute walk. And I'll try and beat my PB, subject to traffic lights changing quickly enough and there not being as many other pedestrians on the pavement to dodge. But I think, you know, walking is an incredibly good form of exercise, and it would be great to see people running more as part of their commute or as part of their everyday journeys. So yeah, I think we could see if anybody is in touch with any of those brands to really put a campaign out there that would back this kind of messaging. It would be very useful.
Cheers, thank you. I also love that everything is a competition in the world of Dame Sarah Storey. Next time we're walking to a meeting, I will definitely make sure I'm ahead of you. And I also like the idea of making everything cool. I think we definitely need to make cycling cool, just so I can feel a bit cooler when I rock up in my
But the thing is, Molly,
helmet and high vis.
I think the way that Molly gets about on a bike is super cool, and I think that's what we need from more. And I guess we just need a really a pop star or somebody to find it super cool, and that's where popular culture then kind of changes things. But that side of things is harder and harder for us to affect, and it needs somebody. You know, you look at the impact Marcus Rashford is having at the moment on a different agenda. That is really important for health as well. And so yeah, the number of footballers who use bikes is huge, but they use bikes in the same way I use bikes, to go as fast as possible. So what we need is, I don't know, somebody like Adele to jump on a bike and baby trailer, and everyone will do it.
Yeah, I was just about to ask who would be your pop star advocate of choice. Is it Adele?
Katy Perry, Kylie, Adele, any of those girls.
All three on a Kylie on the cargo bike, and Adele and Katy Perry in the hold, maybe.
Maybe, but yeah, that sort of thing. She needs to come on stage on a bike next time.
All right, I'll hand back over to Leanne, but thanks for talking, Sarah. It was nice chat.
Thanks, everyone. Great questions.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah, and thank you as well for kind of agreeing to take everyone's questions. I think what you all don't know is that I decided to kind of change the format about 2 days ago, kind of at the 11th hour, and Sarah was just completely okay with it, and yeah, just thank you for taking so much time as well with your answers, and just given us a wealth of information there. So this has obviously been recorded, and so I'll post when I put it up on the website later on, so you can all rewatch it, because there was a lot of information there for us all to take in. And like Molly, I love the way just walking between point to point, you were talking about PB there. Definitely an elite athlete thing. But I think we'll wrap it up there, because I know as well you have to be heading off now as well, Sarah. You're probably getting...
Yeah, I think I have to check out. There's nobody knocking on the window yet, but yeah, I'll be heading home to my normal office.
Yes, but thank you again for joining us. If there's any links, if you want to have Molly shared them during this, if you want to check on them quickly, and we'll wrap it up there. But thank you, Sarah, again.
No, thank you very much. And if you'd like to follow the work that the region's doing, at Cycle Walk SCR, each week we have a different theme that introduces active travel from a different perspective, because it can be quite challenging for some people who are welded to their vehicle to understand why it relates to them. But share it far and wide. We know that people will change habits by somebody close to them giving them some advice. So if you know somebody who's fed up of being stuck in traffic, introduce the subject of active travel to them in a gentle way, over a glass of wine, and suggest you go for a walk together, and that could be a good way to start them on their active journey.